Good morning. My name is Ryan Bray, and welcome to Risk Management Professionals' ongoing webinar series. During today's broadcast, our producers, Kevin and Vincent, will be in the background, keeping us operational and taking questions. Today we're using a GoToWebinar interface to support our presentation. If you should experience any technical difficulties, please contact our office at 877-532-0806. We have staff available to help with troubleshooting. The images that you see, the sizes of the presenter's screen and the PowerPoint presentation are adjustable. If you grab the interface point between the two boxes, you can adjust them to fit what looks best for your viewing device. We also have a dialog box for questions. If you have any questions during the presentation, please submit them through the question box, and after the presentation, we'll include them in our question and answer portion. All right, today we're going to be looking at hazard mitigation planning. I want to give you a little background, an overview of the steps in the planning process, and hopefully give you some tips that will be helpful during your next plan update. To give you a little background, during the late 1980s and into the 90s, the federal government realized that they were spending an increasing amount of capital on disaster relief. As a result, Congress passed the Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000, also called DMA. Among other things, the DMA revitalized federal planning requirements, calling not only for states, which had previously been allowed to develop hazard mitigation plans, but also called for local communities to develop their own plans. In this instance, local communities refers to the county, the city level, some special districts like water districts, schools, and tribal communities. It also set up a 5-year planning cycle. Those that have approved hazard mitigation plans will be required to update their plans every 5 years and submit them to the government for approval. In addition, it granted eligibility for certain grant funding to local communities. The first grant program is the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, which allocates funds for disaster relief just after a disaster has occurred. Also, there's the Pre-Disaster Mitigation Grant Program, which allocates funds for planning and project grants before a disaster occurs. The DMA also facilitated cooperation between state and local authorities. It called for each hazard mitigation plan to work as an extension of the state plan. So if you're a local jurisdiction, you want to make sure that your plan aligns not only with the county plan, but also the goals and objectives that are outlined in your state plan. In addition, it expedited funding allocation. It allowed the local jurisdiction to work directly with the federal government in order to request and obtain grant funding. So it really sped up that process. In addition, the DMA stressed public participation. The words that the FEMA guidance book uses to describe what they're looking for with public participation is comprehensive. They want something that's continuous, and they want public involvement to start early. In addition, they encourage coordination with neighboring communities, neighboring jurisdictions, and various interest groups during plan development. Okay, so what is mitigation? What is hazard mitigation? It's any effort that reduces the loss of life and property by lessening the impact of a disaster. Typically, when I work with groups, our minds automatically jump to large structural projects. If you're going to implement structural integrity, upgrades on a building to prevent the impacts of an earthquake or to lessen the impacts of an earthquake, that's typically what I find people associate with hazard mitigation. However, there's a lot of different things that can fall under that umbrella. Obtaining supplies and equipment. For example, if you were to obtain diesel generators so that for critical facilities, in case you lose power, either as its own event or as a secondary impact, you'd be able to keep those facilities running and improve continuity. That's also mitigation. Public education and outreach, letting people know what to do in the event of a disaster, letting them know what resources are available. Also, sometimes just letting them know that a vulnerability exists. I was just part of a recent webcast provided by FEMA where one of the speakers estimated that nationwide in any community, less than 2% understand their vulnerability to dam failure. This is one example where letting people know that a vulnerability even exists might be a great way to lessen the impact of that and let them become prepared. That's mitigation as well. Natural resource protection. If you've been watching the news, you know, or if you're from this state, you know California is in a severe drought. Anything we can do to make our water use more efficient is going to protect the natural resources, protect the environment. That's mitigation. Also bolstering your emergency services, making sure they have the equipment and the training so that they can respond efficiently and provide better care in the event of a disaster. That's another example of hazard mitigation. So when you're looking at what you can do, you want to keep your mind open. There's a lot of options out there beyond just large structural projects. All right, before I go any further, I want to talk about some terminology. When I've worked with different groups, some of these terms have been a little difficult, a little challenging, so I just want to clarify right here. Hazard mitigation plans or hazard mitigation planning is a plan or any plan that includes the steps of identifying your risks, assessing your vulnerability, and coming up with an action plan to lessen the impact. Now, some people have added additional words to make it a little bit more descriptive about what's included in their plan. For example, a local hazard mitigation plan is a plan that includes only one jurisdiction, as opposed to a multi-jurisdictional plan, which of course is going to include several jurisdictions within a region. They might be able to share resources and knowledge to create a more robust plan because most of them share most of the same vulnerabilities. Separately, a natural hazard mitigation plan. After the DMA was released and local hazard mitigation plans were first being rolled out, many of them only included the natural hazards, earthquake, flood, fire, tsunami, volcano, and these were called natural hazard mitigation plans. As planning progressed, FEMA encouraged local planners to include man-made hazards as well, adversarial human-caused events, hazardous material release, civil unrest. Those, coupled with the natural hazards, created a multi-hazard mitigation plan. Something that I want to point out, and the point of all of this, is to note that they all serve the same basic goal, and they all require the same basic steps. Even though they have a few different things to let you know whether it's one jurisdiction or a few, or whether they're only natural hazards or man-made hazards or both, they're all going to encompass the same ideas and go for the same goal, which is reducing the impact of different hazard events. So I want to make that very clear. In addition, I want to talk about the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Up to this point, I've talked about the federal government, what they've done. This agency is the organization, the federal organization, that has been tasked with managing and allocating disaster relief funding. They're the ones that will give ultimate approval for your plan, and they will provide review. Next is the California Governor's Office of Emergency Services, or CalOES, which was formerly known as the California Emergency Management Agency, or CalEMA. Now, of course, this is California-specific. I know we have a few people tuned in who are not from California. Today, we're going to focus just on California's infrastructure and what's available in California. If you do have questions about your own state, go ahead and email me, and I will deal with you one-on-one to see what resources are available in your state. But the CalOES works as a buffer between the local jurisdiction and the federal government with FEMA. They provide an initial review period for your hazard mitigation plan. They'll work with you to get your plan to FEMA. They're also a great resource. So if you're starting your planning process, it would be a good idea to introduce yourself to the folks in the Hazard Mitigation Review Team. They have an office in Mather, California. They'll be able to provide a good insight on what should be included in your plan, whether something meets regulations, and they also may be able to tell you what resources you might need to conduct your your risk assessment. So keep those in mind. They're a very good resource. Okay. According to the FEMA Hazard Mitigation Planning Guidebook, hazard mitigation, the planning process can be organized into 4 logical steps. The first, organizing your resources. Then you want to identify and assess your risks. Then you want to develop a mitigation strategy or action plan. Then you want to look at implementing your plan, getting it approved and adopted, and then the maintenance of your plan. Right, for the first phase, the first thing you want to do is create your planning team. This planning team is going to be responsible for helping you develop your plan, providing input, providing review. They might actually help you do some of your research. This is going to be integral to getting a plan development off the ground. You want to include members with varied backgrounds from your own jurisdiction. If you're a city, you might want to consider community development, public works, finance, administration, emergency management. All of those are good ideas. If you're an agency, if you're a water district, for example, you might want to look at operations, engineering, administration, and finance. If you have an environmental section, you want to bring those people in. Those are all going to be great. Then you want to look at local jurisdictions. As I mentioned previously, the DMA calls for neighboring communities to be made part of the planning process. If you're a city, you want to look at the cities that are around you, maybe somebody at the county, want to bring those in, make them part of your team. If you're a district, maybe you want to look at the cities that are within your service area. Again, you want to look at the county. All of these people are going to be probably pretty familiar with the vulnerabilities of what affects your jurisdiction, and they're going to be able to provide a lot of good insight and knowledge that perhaps something just within your team may not have been available. So they're going to be a great resource. Something else I want to add here is actually some members of the public. Many organizations have commissions and committees of people with special education and background that are already reviewing different ordinances and regulations and policies that are coming through your jurisdiction. They're going to have insider knowledge on what's going on in your organization. They can be a great resource, so keep these people in mind when you're building your planning team. The next thing we want to do is research historical hazards. You want to look at your previous plan, if this is an update. You want to look at the plans of the jurisdictions around you, see what they've said have been their hazards. You want to look at newspaper clippings, papers written about your area. See what's happened in your area. See what historical events have happened in your region. And of course, you want to take a look at the state and county plans, see what they've included to make sure that you're aligned. Make sure that things are looking, that they coordinate. Next, you want to collect critical facility data. You want to assess your assets. You want to see what you've got and what can be affected by a hazard event. For a city, this is very easy. You want to look at for a district, this is very easy. All of your assets are critical assets. You want to include them all. If you're looking at a city, it's not just your governing buildings and large governing bodies. If you have recreational areas, parks, you want to make sure those are included in addition to your city hall, public works, public yard, all of those things. In addition, we like to add schools and hospitals. While this isn't, obviously, most of the time these aren't owned by a city, but they are part of the emergency response. Many times they're used as shelters. This helps make a more robust plan. Typically, we include schools and hospitals if they exist in our region. In addition, you want to include police and fire. Make sure that your emergency response facilities are included in your critical facility data. All right, next we want to go through, we've identified the hazards, we've looked at the hazards that are in our region. We have a better idea of what's included. So now you want to get your planning team together. You want to identify the specific hazards that are going to affect your region and be included in your plan. These might be natural, man-made, as I said before, but you want to set a list of what hazards are going to be included and later ranked in your hazard mitigation plan. As I said, the next step is to rank those hazards. You want to put them give them a hierarchy of which ones present the most vulnerability for your organization. When doing this, you want to consider the probability and the potential impact of each of these hazards. Here at Risk Management Professionals, we use a simple matrix. We assign relative values to increasing severities of potential impact, increasing probability for each of these hazards. We multiply those factors together. We line them up in numerical order. It gives us a hierarchy, and we can see clearly which ones the planning team saw as the hazards that presented the most vulnerability for the jurisdiction and the ones that showed the least. Now that you've got your list, your hazards are ranked, you want to profile each of those hazards. In doing this, you want to discuss what the hazards are, how they happen. You want to look at historical events in your own region or maybe in your state that have occurred. This is the time to use mapping programs and find out which areas of your region are more susceptible to different hazards and which assets lie in those regions and what's going to be vulnerable. When you're working with a multi-jurisdictional plan, you want to make sure that while you're assessing the risks and the vulnerabilities of each hazard, you want to make sure that you document where each jurisdiction varies. If, for instance, you have a region where only certain jurisdictions or certain organizations are on a coastline, they might be the only ones that are affected by sea level rise. So for those jurisdictions, you want to document that sea level rise applies to these, but maybe not to the whole group. So you want to make sure that's included. Okay, while we're talking about our hazards, I want to discuss climate change. This has been a big topic for hazard mitigation planning within the last year. It comes as a result of several executive orders from the President looking for local communities to implement mitigation measures for climate change. It's been pushed. Sea level rise, specifically as a result of global warming, has been a growing issue and things that they want addressed. So in 2015, in March, the FEMA, Cal OES, and the California Natural Resources Department released the California Adaptation Planning Guide, or the APG. This planning guide is unique because it doesn't apply specifically to hazard mitigation planning. The idea was that it was designed to guide users to assess the risks and the impacts of climate change and allow each organization to implement those ideas and implement mitigation into any public program that it made sense. Perhaps a capital improvement project, making sure that new development includes items that resist the impacts of climate change. Maybe your general plan, you want to include different hazards in your safety element. However, you'll find that most of the APG talks about how to assess your risks and how to implement, how to look at the dangers that are presented by each of these hazard events, and it aligns very closely with what's in the hazard mitigation planning process. So it's very natural that it would be included in hazard mitigation. I'd like to point out for those of us in California, in the third portion, Understanding Regional Characteristics, it provides a suggested list of climate change-related impacts. It separates the state into different regions, and depending on which region you're in, there's a separate list of the different climate change-related impacts to consider. This is a great springboard to start out if you're trying to just begin incorporating climate change into your planning process. I want to mention, again, I said sea level rise was a big push. It was one of the main concerns when including climate change as part of your planning process. If sea level rise is something that will affect your community, again, this is very new. There isn't a whole lot of information on how much you need to do or how far you need to go to make sure that you'll get FEMA approval. But in my most recent conversations with some of the regulators, they said that they just want us to start the conversation. So that's something good to consider, that we're just looking to start the conversation, get some basic data on how sea level rise might affect your organization. I've also found that many communities that have already included sea level rise have used HAZUS-MH, which is a FEMA-provided software that can model the impacts of different hazard scenarios. Right now, I believe it's focused more on flood, earthquake, and hurricane, but the flood portion can be adapted to assess sea level rise by taking the flood analysis portion and modeling coastal flooding. So that's something to keep in mind. That might be a good resource if this is something you're just starting to do. For those of us who don't have sea level rise, and most of the projects that I've been involved with, this has not been an issue. I've gone back to that list, looked at those suggestions, and seen things like reduced precipitation, increased temperatures, reduced water supply. In our plans, we have said, okay, if we see these three hazards or these three impacts, our planning team might not necessarily see that as a direct impact of climate change. Instead, if we're looking at increased temperatures, reduced water supply, and reduced precipitation, we might identify that as a drought. And so therefore, any actions that we might do to prevent the impacts of a drought can be seen under the drought hazard profile. So far, this method has been positively commented on by regulators. This might be a good method for you, something to keep in mind. That's what we've been doing. All right, so we've put our planning team together, we've gathered some information, we've identified our hazards, we've ranked them, we know what our vulnerability is, now we need to know what to do about it. And the next step is to develop a mitigation plan or an action plan. These are the steps that the planning team will brainstorm that we might be able to take in order to lessen the impacts of our hazard scenarios. And the first thing you need to do is develop some plan goals and objectives. Now I'm going to give you a tip. This is just Ryan. This is not something you'll find in a FEMA guidance document. But I always want to see at least one verb and one noun in each of my goals. For several of the programs that I've updated, I've gone and looked at previous plans and found that their goals might just be public education or environmental. Obviously, those are supported by different objectives, but if I was updating the plan, I would make a recommendation to change those to say, enhance public education, protect or preserve the environment. I think that these make it very clear what you're trying to do and communicate better to planning teams that might not have been involved in the planning process when it comes time to requesting grant funding or implementing projects. So I think this is a really great tip. Once you've got your actions together, you're going to want to rank those. You're going to take a look at the costs that are involved. And when we're talking about costs, it's not just capital. We want to talk about staff time. We want to look at the environmental impacts of each of your actions. We also want to look to see if there's going to be any social impacts. Is this going to be well received by the community, or are we going to have some problems? You want to list all those out. In addition, you want to look at the benefits. This might be reduced loss of life, reduced impact on property. You want to list out all the benefits. Here at Risk Management Professionals, when we rank, we use a very simple range. It's a high, medium, or low. When the planning team reviews the benefits and the costs, if the benefits clearly outweigh the cost, we give it a high ranking. This is going to be the best bang for our buck. If the benefits appear to outweigh the costs, but there might be some research that might have to be done, you might have to refine it a little bit, we'll give that a medium. And if the costs appear to outweigh the benefits, we give it a low, and that lets future planning teams know that this needs to be reviewed. Maybe it needs a little tweaking before it's ready to be implemented. Another tip I want to add, and this is just in keeping with the spirit of hazard mitigation, many teams like to use their mitigation actions sort of as a wish list. It's filled with items that require federal funding in order to implement. I would like to encourage you not to do that. It's great to include some items that require federal funding. It is available, and if you have an approved plan, you are eligible. But FEMA funding is often limited. You have to win it on a competitive basis. It's possible that you might go through a 5-year period without receiving any federal funding. If that's the case, you want to make sure that there are some actions that use the resources that you already have, maybe that can expand on some things you're already doing. And so that way, after 5 years, you have made some progress and your communities are more resilient. Just something to keep in mind. You won't find that in a FEMA guidance document. That's just me. All right. The next step is you've got your planning team together. You've assessed your risks. You have identified your vulnerabilities. You've put your plan together. You know what your actions are. And you've created a draft. You've gone to your governing body. Said, yes, go ahead and submit this. Let's get plan approval. Now begins the road to plan adoption. I call it the road because it is a journey. It oftentimes happens that approval of your plan happens at last as opposed to at once. I'm going to explain that here just a little bit. The first step is to submit your plan to Cal OES. Again, if you're not in California, this may not apply to you, but for those of us in the state of California, this is the first step in obtaining plan approval. You want to submit your plan to Cal OES. The team there will review your plan, provide recommendations. You'll supply them with updated sections. Once they're happy with what they see, they'll forward it on to FEMA, where there another reviewer will go through another round of review. They'll provide comments when those comments are implemented, and they're happy. And they will provide you with a preliminary notice of approval. At this point, it's time for you to take your plan back to your governing body, let them know that you've got your preliminary approval, and have a formal adoption. Once the formal adoption is received, you want to send your resolution back to FEMA, in which time they will provide you with your final letter of approval. It's at this point, the date on that letter will start the 5-year cycle again. 5 years from that date, you will need to update your plan. And the last I heard, they were suggesting that you allow 6 months for this entire process. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about your project timeline. You want to allow at least 6 months for the plan approval process. Going further, I've actually heard them suggesting that you give 18 months for the entire planning process. So if you're looking at updating your plan, just realize this is sort of a long-term thing, and you want to give yourself, at best, at least 18 months to complete your plan update. All right, plan maintenance. Moving forward, again, this is another one of my opinions. For true hazard mitigation planning, it requires a change in the mindset of the people who are running your organization, and it needs someone to champion plan goals and objectives. What I mean is that you need your organization to be thinking about, during its normal operations, how it can make your organization more resilient. For example, perhaps you see a new development coming in for a large revenue location. Perhaps you're a city. Maybe it's a coliseum. Maybe it's some sort of amphitheater. But you note that this could be labeled as another a terrorist target, or something that might be something for adversarial human-caused events, something of that nature. Perhaps you could update your ordinances to require, in your jurisdiction, that high-revenue locations that can be used as a terrorist attack or might be a terrorist target need to increase their security features. Maybe they have to have some sort of requirement. In this way, you've made your location more resilient through your normal operations. That didn't take a whole lot of extra funding, a whole lot of extra effort. Just as ordinances are coming through and it's time to update, you've included this. The mindset is there, so people are thinking about it. This might not be a good idea for your jurisdiction, but things along those lines are something to keep in mind. Oftentimes, it's difficult to keep a large group of people thinking this way when new development comes up or ordinances are about to be updated. So you really need somebody who keeps hazard mitigation at the forefront and looks for ways for it to be implemented through what's already going on, to remind people that this is something we need to be thinking about. Again, I want to clarify that this is just my opinion. This is not included in the FEMA guidance. I just think it's a good practice. So the guidance document does say, though, that we need to describe a method and a schedule for monitoring, evaluating, and updating the hazard mitigation plan within a 5-year cycle. At Risk Management Professionals, we usually suggest an annual review. I usually suggest people take somewhere between a half hour to an hour to look at the hazards that were identified, take a look at the critical assets and see if any of their vulnerabilities have changed. Maybe there's new assets to add. Take a look at the mitigation actions and assess whether things that weren't possible maybe at the time that the plan was written, but now resources are available and it's a good time to move forward. See if those things exist, if there's minor changes to the plan, or if these things can be taken care of. What I'll do is I'll print out my notes, slip it in the back so that during the next 5-year update, they can be included during the planning process. If there's something more substantial, you have a severe change in your vulnerability, this would be a time to bring the planning team together. Once again, review what you found, make the necessary changes, and then resubmit your updated plan to FEMA. Something else is that the community will need to continue to be able to participate in the plan maintenance process. To do this, typically at RMP, we suggest that you leave your plan on your jurisdiction's website, allow people to comment, and that if any of the actions that you have proposed in the plan are going to be moved forward, that either through your board of directors, your city council meeting, through public newsletters, you let people know that it's happening and give them a chance to comment on what you're doing. So those are some good things to keep in mind. While we're talking about the public, I want to give some tips for public involvement. As I said earlier, FEMA requires continuous and early public involvement during the whole planning process. In my experience, traditional methods that I've seen for public involvement have oftentimes been expensive and difficult to pull off, and don't actually bring in a whole lot of comments. Some of the things that I've seen have been town meetings and workshops. I've heard of people who, they make large displays, they're catered, they've got a lot of public outreach letting people know that they're there, and then oftentimes, there's nobody who shows up or one or two, which doesn't seem to be a good use of resources for the return that you get. Mailers and flyers I've also seen those work, but I've seen budgets of $10,000 to $25,000 for a simple flyer. I'm not sure if that's in your budget for hazard mitigation. I know many of the teams that I've worked with, that really wasn't a possibility. Newspapers are great, but of course, they're cheaper, but they don't reach as many people. I can't remember the last time I had a newspaper delivered to my house. Public newsletters are good, but you have to have people signed on. I've also seen people invite the public to participate in planning meetings, which is a great, cheap way to get the public involved. For many of the jurisdictions that I've worked with, that wasn't a good solution. And if you're one of those jurisdictions, you know why. But I found that using, and I know this sounds cliche, and I feel like I've heard this so many times, but using digital and electronic resources to open those channels for public input have been very successful for the plans that we've worked on at RMP. We've used public newsletters, interactive webcasts like what you're participating in right now. We've used social media like Facebook and Twitter, and we've had some really great success. I want to talk about the public survey. Typically, when I've talked to regulators about public surveys, there wasn't a whole lot of support for them, and that's because in the past, a lot of public surveys did not give very good results. There wasn't a whole lot of information being received. However, RMP has utilized, we've created our own template. It's about 10 to 15 questions, and when I did talk to Cal OES about what we were doing, they seemed very, very supportive. We posted on the jurisdiction's website, monthly newsletters. For agencies, we included it in some of their regular billing documentation, very cheap ways of getting it out. And through the survey, we were able to establish a public profile of the participants. We were able to look at how long they'd lived in the city, whether they owned or rented their home, if they had received information about hazards, if they had taken actions in their own home to mitigate the effects of a personal emergency. And through that, we've made some assumptions that those who had lived in the city for a longer time might understand better the hazards that affect the region. We said that those that had received information or perhaps took steps in their own home to mitigate an emergency, the effects of an emergency, might better understand what the jurisdiction was trying to do with regards to preparing themselves for disaster. And typically what we find is that a good portion of the public is credible. That we've never found a team or a group of responders that we found that just really didn't know what they were talking about. We were able to establish they provided credible insight into what we were trying to do. Secondly, allowed the participants to rank identified hazards. And this was really great. We took all of the hazards that were identified by the planning team during the planning process, laid them out in no specific order, and asked the public to tell us how concerned they were about each of the hazards on a scale of 1 to 7. Then, of course, everything was averaged, put in numerical order, and the public was able to rank the hazards that the steering team had identified. And then we were able to take the two lists and compare them. Of course, the things that were similar were great, but the things that were different, we made different inferences about why that information is. Why is it that terrorism, for a community that probably doesn't have a lot of terrorist targets, sees it very high? Is it because there's been a lot of news? Is this something that the media has brought to the forefront of people's minds? This is what they're concerned about. It's been really great input. And then the planning team was able to decide, do we want to change the way we've ranked our hazards to match what the public has said, or use it as a continuous supply of public, use it as public comment, so that when we're going to implement a project, we can look and see, okay, is this one of the hazards that they identified as their highest concern? If so, and the project will lessen that concern, we can assume that this will be received positively by the community. That was another thing that we got out of our survey. In addition, we allowed the public to comment on the best methods to disperse safety information. And I think, again, this brings us back. It kind of, it just supported the fact that people are looking for digital and electronic communications. Across the board, in all of the surveys that I've worked on, electronic communication has been the highest ranking, some of the highest ranking across the board for all different regions. We found that this was a success. I've used it several times. The fewest comments I've ever received was 30. When you're talking about a town meeting that you might only get 1 or 2, to have 30 focused comments on a hazard mitigation plan update, I think is a really great success. I think at the most we've had somewhere around 90 people comment. So we saw this as a great success, a very cheap and efficient way to get comments in from the public. Next, we use interactive webcasts. Like what you're on, we've used GoToMeeting, we've used a couple of other platforms. We found this was a great way to get information out into the public and allow them to comment. When coupled with social media, it really became a success. I worked with a jurisdiction recently, and we used their Facebook page to broadcast a live feed. We used the Facebook Live app. While at the time, we only had 10 people signed on for the live feed, by the time that the draft was completed, we had over 600 views of the presentation. We had been able to reach 600 people in one effort that was very cheap, didn't cost us very much, just our time to put it together. So we considered that a great success. Coupled with a really positive survey, we reached over 700 people during the planning process, which we considered that a great success. Something else that you can think about, live feeds and webcasts like the one you're watching today, they're all being recorded. You can take that recording, post it on your website, and just really maximize the visibility for the effort that you're putting in. So keep that in mind as well. Okay, so we've gone over the background. I hope you have a little bit better understanding of how we began putting together hazard mitigation plans. I hope you know a little bit more about the planning process, and that the tips that I've given as far as public involvement will really help bolster your efforts during your next plan update. If there are any questions, this is the time. Go ahead and put them in the question box, and our presenters will read them aloud for us. Do we have any questions?
Okay, the first question from the audience. Are there any specific hazards I should involve in my plan?
That's a good question. The answer is no. The answer is no. The government is not telling people what they should include in their plans. That's left up to the jurisdiction for them to decide what their vulnerabilities are. Now, that being said, usually in California, we want to make sure that earthquakes, flood, and fire are there. If they're not there, you might get some kickback, some questions asked, why aren't they there? So that might be another tip. If you find that either one of these is not an issue, you might want to notate that in your plan, that specifically for earthquake, flood, and fire. And then, of course, sea level rise, I've told you, is a really hot item right now. If you're on the coast or you feel like sea level rise might be considered an issue, maybe not right at the present time, you might want to put that in your plan as well, that it's been omitted for these reasons, just because they'll probably be looking for them if you have if you're in a coastal region. So, good question, good question. Is there anything else?
Yeah, we have another question from the audience. If I don't have an HMP, does that mean I can't get government assistance after a disaster?
That's also a good question. So the answer is no, they're not going to leave you hanging. As I said, having an approved hazard mitigation plan allows you to work directly with FEMA to ask for funding and disaster relief. However, if you find yourself without an approved plan and a disaster occurs, you can always ask for funding through the next level of government. So if you're a city, if you're a district, you can apply to the county to request funding on your behalf. Now, they will be tasked with managing the grant funds that are allocated for your jurisdiction, and they'll need to manage the project. So you may not have the control that you would if you had your own hazard mitigation plan approved, but you won't be left high and dry. There are always ways, and if your county for some reason didn't have a plan, you could always apply to the state. So there's going to be somewhere that you can go and ask for assistance. So that's also a good question. Are there any other questions? All right, well, that concludes our presentation today. Thank you so much for being a part. If you have any questions, my email address is listed there on the slide. Please feel free to send me any questions you have. We'll see about getting those answered. Thank you again for joining us. Have a great afternoon.